Alberta is moving forward with its policies targeting transgender youth in the province. The United Conservative government tabled 3 pieces of legislation in the last hour that will do a number of things, including ban the use of puberty blockers for youth aged 15 and under, impose mandatory parental consent of gender-related preferred name or pronoun changes at school, and exclude transgender women from eligibility in female-only sports. Here's how the opposition responded.
Punching down on trans kids does not appear in the top 50 of things Albertans are concerned about. Yet this government has fully 1/4 of all of their legislation in this session is on anti-trans legislation, something no one is asking for.
Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta, and she joins me now. Premier Smith, welcome back to the show.
Hi, David.
Let's start with your response to Naheed Nenshi there, saying that this is legislation that nobody is asking for, but you're going ahead with it.
Well, look, we've been watching what's been happening internationally, and in Europe, they've become very concerned about whether or not there's sufficient guidelines around kids who are experiencing gender dysphoria. We've been watching, in particular, the work of Dr. Hilary Klaas, who I think has done the most comprehensive review of the research. And what she's found is that there really isn't very good long-term information about the effects of puberty blockers. Not a lot of very good long-term information about what happens to kids once they transition young, whether they stay with it, whether they reverse course. And we believe that we have to make sure that we're giving appropriate mental health support to kids, a psychological support, and that they're waiting until they're old enough to make these decisions. That's what the motivation behind the legislation is today.
Okay, there's a few things I want to go through on this. It says right off the top of your press information about this that you're banning gender reassignment surgeries for minors. Already, what they call bottom surgeries are illegal in Canada for anyone under the age of 18. So what exactly are you banning when it comes to surgeries if those are already illegal?
Well, we wanted to make it sure that certain that both top and bottom surgeries would not be allowed until a person is 18 years of age and older, until they're an adult. We have looked back historically, and we found that there were 8 top surgeries that were done for gender reassignment on minors between 2022 and 2023. So it is occurring, and we want to make sure that kids are making those decisions when they're old enough to understand the consequences of it. If you no longer have breasts, and ultimately at a later stage in life you decide to have children, you can't breastfeed. These are important things that I think adults need to be able to fully assess the consequences of it. It's part of the reason why we want to make sure no permanent changes are made to a child's body until they're old enough to be able to understand those consequences and weigh them.
You're also looking, though, to ban the use of puberty blockers for children 15 and under who experience body dysmorphia and other issues. But if a kid and their parent and their doctors and their psychologists all agree that puberty blockers are necessary, you're still going to say no. Why would you substitute your judgment for medical professionals, parents, and the kid?
Well, look, I mean, if you don't go through puberty, you can't have children. You have to become sexually mature in order to be able to have children. And so that is part of the reason why we think it's very important for kids to go through that process. And if, when they become old enough to understand the consequences of their decision at age 16 or 17, that they can begin that process with psychological support, doctor support, and with parental support. I don't think anybody other than a person has the right to decide what their fertility is going to look like, whether or not they're going to have children. That's a very personal decision, and it's a decision that adults make.
But you're deciding for them, though, aren't you? Or, I mean, you are in effect deciding for them, because you talk to people who have transitioned, who have gone through this. They say that if they had gone through puberty, or if they did go through puberty, then when they chose the surgeries later in life, they were far more invasive, with far more risk. And they felt they should have been allowed to make the decision with their family and with their medical practitioners rather than have the government get into it.
Well, and I have spoken with transgender individuals who are delighted to be able to have children and have kids. And if they'd gone prematurely and made that decision, they might not have their kids one day. One of our people who stood with us today, Tiffany Gillis, she talked about how she wants to be involved with her kids if they were to ever make the same decision that she ended up making. And that's what we want to be able to preserve is all choices. We make lots of decisions in government to decide when children are of a capacity and mature enough to make decisions. We don't let them drink or do drugs. Don't let them sign contracts. We don't let them drive cars. We don't let them vote. There's all kinds of restrictions that we do because we recognize that there's a maturity aspect that you need to have when you're making decisions that are going to have long-term consequences. This is one of those adult decisions that kids are going to have to wait until they're a little bit older to make them.
Well, but by then, I mean, by preventing them from going through it because you don't want them to make the decision too early, but you also run the risk on the other side of forcing them to wait too long to get the treatment they feel they need and they feel they want, right? Like if a doctor and a psychologist and the parents and the kid are all on board, isn't that their choice?
Well, it's ultimately the choice of the individual. And I think we have to recognize that 10-year-olds, asking 10-year-olds to be able to make decisions about whether or not they want to have sex or have children is probably not an appropriate age to make those decisions. There isn't also long-term evidence that has been done to understand what the consequences are of being on these kinds of powerful drugs at a very young age. And so it is up to the medical community not to make decisions first and then do the study later. That's not how medical research works. What we do is we do medical research and then we have enough body of evidence in order to be able to make sound decisions. And unfortunately, Hilary Cass, when she did her review, found that there just is not very good evidence on this. The results are mixed, and the stakes are too high to continue going forward without knowing what those answers are and having kids making decisions that are going to permanently impact their bodies and their ability to have children. That's why we're just saying that we're going to put some guidelines around that so that they wait a little bit until they're a little bit older.
I get that you keep coming back to the ability to have children, and I understand that. I got 2 kids myself, and so I understand all of that, but I also never went through what trans kids go through. So I don't presume to speak for them, but the trans adults I've spoken with who said making us go through puberty without allowing us to use the puberty blockers made it harder. Would make it harder. It made the surgeries more invasive and more intense when they were finally able to get the treatment that when they were an adult and were able to seek it and get it. There is a consequence to what you're doing here to negate the consequences you're trying to prevent, is there not? I mean, I don't know how many people have this done and regret it, but there are a lot of people who want it and were denied it, who felt that they were put through pain as a result of it.
Well, one of the women who stood with us today, Kelly, she's created a detransitioning organization. She transitioned as an adult and then lived that way for a number of years and realized that she had a lot of work to do on herself. There were a lot of reasons why she hated her body, and she ended up transitioning back. And her point was, boy, if I didn't know why I was doing this when I was 37, how was a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old supposed to know? So I think we have to take the evidence from across the spectrum. We've got to analyze that and weigh it based on the kinds of decisions that we allow young people to make. And we believe, based on some of the work that has been done in the area of medical choice in the past, that once a child becomes mature enough, they can make their own medical decisions. We think that age is 16 or 17, and that's why we've put limitations in for kids who are younger. Okay,
a choice that young kids might want to make that is not permanent is the changing of the pronoun or even the name they want to use in school. You're putting severe restrictions on that, and I noticed that even in a case where it is believed that notifying the parents of a request of a kid to change their pronoun would result in harm and make things worse at home, you're still going to do it. Only after a guidance counselor or a social worker has been made available to the student. Why would you notify knowing it will cause harm? Like a guidance counselor cannot offset the disruption in the home life.
Well, I have to tell you, the default position we should have is that parents love their kids and support their kids and want what's best for their kids. And you can't really have an environment where everybody in a school community knows that a child has changed their name and changed their pronoun, and everybody rushes to keep it a secret from the family and the parents. That's not a very healthy environment. If you've spoken with transgender individuals, you'll know that once they've chosen a name and they've chosen their pronouns, they don't want to be mispronounced and they don't want to be their dead name used. And so putting a child in a situation where they're living a double life for months or years, that doesn't seem to me to be a very supportive environment to be in either. We think the role of adults in an individual's life is to assist them, if that's the direction they're going, in bringing their family in. And we always have supports for anybody who is going to be in a situation where they feel like they need to be out of their home environment. So our default is that we believe that families will support their kids. And I think that should be the message that we give to kids who are going through gender confusion.
No, I get that. And I understand that your position is to default to the parents. But I know some people are transitioning and they haven't given their new name to everybody in their life. There is still a segmented disclosure of that, so it's not universal, and here the school would do it for them essentially, because it says here in your news release, Premier, that if parental notification is expected to result in psychological or emotional harm to the student, the school board would ensure the student receives assistance prior to notifying parents. So this is not, there's potential harm, there is known harm to the student by notifying the parents, and yet you will persist with the notification. Why can't there be flexibility for a case-by-case basis at minimum based on the potential risks of this child?
Look, we have to decide who is going to be the custodial adult in a person's life when they're too young to make decisions for themselves. And I think of our default is that parents have the right to know what's going on with their kids. Parents have the right to determine the education for their kids. Teachers in a person's life are very fleeting. Parents are forever. And so you cannot, if you're going to have a child embarking on this pathway, they need the support of the permanent social group that's going to be around them. That is their parents, that is their family, and it is our responsibility to make sure that we're not doing anything to break down that relationship. These are very difficult, challenging decisions. The child ultimately does go on to hormones. Often they're going to be on their parents' insurance to be able to cover it. And so trying to disconnect families from these decisions makes no sense.
But if they're
far more for the counseling to take place so that everyone can come on board in supporting that child in the best way possible.
But if they're unwilling to tell their parents or don't want to tell their parents, or if it's known that psychological harm will protect the parents, clearly there is some sort of a breakdown in that relationship. And the notification over their desires, even with counseling, leads them into harm. I mean, this is what your own literature says, Premier, that even if it's known to cause harm, you'll do it.
Look, David, we're talking about a child who has made the decision to change their name in their school community, who is changing their pronouns in their school community, who's probably using the washrooms of the opposite gender, who's dressing in the opposite way, who's going to participate in all of the school activities with their new name and new pronouns. And I just think it's unrealistic to think that everybody in a school community is going to know that except for the parents. If a child is coming out in a community in that way, the parents need to be brought in. They need to know.
Okay, well, I mean, that sounds like a policy for the parent as opposed to a policy for the child, right? Like the child is their own person and feels their own way. And we're talking 14 and 15 this applies to, right? I mean, how do you balance that if it is going to inflict this emotional damage and psychological damage using the language here on the kid? It seems like it's balanced entirely in favor of the parent.
Well, look, I mean, when children are minors and are not able to make decisions on their own, it's been the position of society that the parents or guardians make those decisions on their behalf. They become a certain age eventually where they can make their own decisions. A lot of age 16, as I understand it, is the age at which children can become emancipated from their parents. That's around the age that courts have determined that they can make their own medical choices. And that's why we've done the same. At age 15 and under, parents have to be involved in these decisions. Age 16 and older, then they're going to have more autonomy. That's why we think we've taken a balanced approach.
It's clear you've heard a lot from parents. I heard you said this. You've heard from hundreds, if not thousands, of parents who are concerned about this. When it comes to trans voices that you've consulted, you've mentioned Tiffany Gillis. You've mentioned her a couple of times, and we've had Tiffany Gillis on this show. How broadly did you consult in the trans community, and how convinced are you that the people you spoke to represented the majority view of that community and weren't minority outliers?
Well, look, we believe that we should be talking with everyone in the community, and we've done a broad base of consultation. I guess my arts culture minister, who also leads on this file, had multiple roundtables, talked to 51 different individuals and groups within Alberta, and we're hearing the concerns, and we're doing our best to find the right balance. We have to be mindful that there are those who feel like they transitioned inappropriately and are transitioning back. There are those who felt rushed into transition. There are those who felt they didn't have all the information on transition. And there's those who are perfectly happy with transition. And so we wanted to hear from everyone so that we could make sure that we were bringing forward a package of proposals that was going to support the child as they were developing who they are going to be, included parents, and also made sure that we were protecting girls and women to be able to participate in competitive sport without being disadvantaged. So that's what the package of reforms are. It comes from a broad base of consultation with a wide variety of individuals, both in the community and outside it.
Okay, I want to touch on the sports issue because you're essentially banning trans women from competing in female-only sports leagues. And this is something that does come up in the conversation around this, and people point to these examples of someone who was assigned a male sex at birth who transitioned and compete in sports, and they say it's unfair. In the last census, there were only 100,000 people in Canada who identified as transgender or non-binary. It's a very small subset of the population to begin with. The amount who would be involved in competitive sports in a way that disadvantages people will be an even smaller subset of that. I mean, how many examples of this do you think you're trying to prevent with this legislation? Because the number must be statistically utterly insignificant just based on the population data we have.
Well, I guess we've all seen instances of athletes coming forward feeling like they were disadvantaged. We've seen it in swimming, we've seen it in powerlifting, and we even had a young woman who stood with us, Hannah, who experienced in the last couple of years in track and field. She's been involved in competitive sport for 10 years, and she lost a race by one stride. Because she was competing against a transgender athlete. She felt that was unfair. And we have to remember, when you're in competitive sport, there's a lot of consequences. There's a reason why we have female-only sports. If we didn't need them, then we never would have developed them in the first place. And the reason we have them is because we recognize that around age 12, boys start getting bigger and stronger. They start getting taller. They start having more dexterity, better hand-eye coordination. And we want to make sure that there's a meaningful pathway for women and girls to participate in sport. That doesn't change if we're talking about transgender athletes as well. We still want to be able to have women be able to exceed or to be able to succeed at the highest level of sport without disadvantage.
But what's the data there, Premier? Like you, in the material your government put out today, you have April Hutchinson and Hannah Pilling, and they say has experience competing against a transgender athlete is the language, not multiple, not a lot of transgender athletes. It's singular. So I mean, what is the data on this? Because it seems like for multiple pieces of government legislation to come in, you must be solving a problem of significant size, and it doesn't seem to be borne out in the world of sports, given the level of response here.
Well, look, I mean, we're looking internationally, and the UN rapporteur who went out and looked at women and girls in sports came to this exact conclusion, that for safety of women and for fairness, that we should have categories for biological girls and women only. That's a United Nations report looking at international evidence. They also indicated that they felt that there should be more open categories, and we're doing the same thing to allow for competitive sport that are co-ed or gender neutral. So I think we have to be a little bit more broad-minded and look at what they're seeing internationally, and be able to draw some conclusions about some of the guideposts that we need to put in here.
Your political critics and opponents in Alberta say a lot of this and a lot of the other legislation and moves you've been making in recent weeks has to do with the leadership review you're going to face, I believe, in Red Deer on Saturday. It's this weekend, the United Conservative Party leadership vote. How do you respond to that? People think a lot of this is you pandering to your base.
We've been very thoughtful about the approach that we've taken. It took us a long time as a caucus to talk through and hear all of the evidence that we were seeing. We've been watching international evidence. The CAS report has come out in recent months, as has this UN report that I made reference to. We've seen changes taking place in a number of European countries. We've got different viewpoints in our caucus, and we wanted to make sure that we were very thoughtful in balancing those viewpoints. So I announced in February that we were going to be going in this direction. We took the summer to continue our consultation, draft the legislation, run it through our process, and we just came back into the legislature this week. Right. This is our first opportunity to be able to put it forward. So that's the process that we went through.
So EGAL, just as a final question, I promise because I kept you long and I appreciate your time. EGAL and others say they're going to challenge this in court, that there will be litigation to try to prevent these changes. You've mused about using the notwithstanding clause in the past. Would you do that to protect this, or will you live with the verdict of a court should it come to that?
Well, look, the court also says, or the charter also says that you're allowed to put limitation on rights if it's demonstrable that it's reasonable, and we think that this is both. We think that we've demonstrated that we have been thoughtful. We know that as children age and become more mature, they can make more decisions on their own, and we're allowing for that. But we know that when children are young and don't understand the long-term consequences, we do end up protecting them. We also know that parents love their children and that they are the principal caregivers and decision makers when they're young, and that we want to make sure that they're involved in the process. And I think that we'll hear from a lot of female athletes who are delighted to be able to compete freely in their sport. So I think we'll see how it ends up playing out. But I think we have to demonstrate to the court that we've been reasonable, and I think we have. We've been trying to find the right balance.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, appreciate the time. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Okay, so as we just discussed there with the Alberta Premier, Danielle Smith announced these changes earlier this year and was faced with backlash from advocacy groups including Egal Canada and Skipping Stone, who promised to take legal action against the Alberta government once the legislation was tabled. Well, now that day has come. Amelia Newbert is the founding of Skipping Stone, and she joins me now. Amelia, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to ask about the lawsuit that you and Egal Canada, are you going to move ahead with it? Is there anything you've seen in this legislation that would necessarily change your mind?
There's nothing that's changed our mind. I think, both us as an organization, Egal, individuals and organizations and professional associations across the province, the country, and internationally have spoken on the harm that this legislation could cause, will cause, has already caused. Really encouraged opportunities for the government to explore them and to be aware of that harm, and we've seen no changes. Despite whatever consultation the government might be talking about, there's has been no deviation from that original intention. And so absolutely, it is our intention to continue exploring every legal avenue available to us to ensure that the rights of trans and gender diverse youth and their families are respected, are acknowledged, and are upheld.
Was your group consulted? Were you consulted by the Alberta government in any way? I know right out of the gate you opposed it. I remember, I believe we spoke to you on the show back when it happened, or your organization. I mean, were you consulted at all? Premier Smith said 51 groups and people were consulted. Were you part of that?
I think that's a bit of, when we talk about 51 groups and numerous sort of roundtables with Minister Furr, it's a bit of cherry picking information. I can tell you actually 2 days before the legislation was released, I myself was at a consultation with the minister that was just a global check-in about the state of how the government could support trans and gender diverse individuals and to us LGBTQIA plus individuals of all sorts. And I stood in that meeting very clearly, as did numerous people, and say, one really strong step that we could take right now is to assure that there won't be right restricting legislations passed towards trans or gender diverse folks and youth and families, right. As was mentioned in their convention a little bit earlier. And there was no response to that. And 2 days later, we saw this legislation come out. And so our perception, and agencies and organizations we've talked to around the country, or certainly around the province, say that if there has been any form of consultation, it's been, we'll check the boxes, we'll listen to what you have to say, ignore it, and continue on anyways. So I wouldn't call that consultation, I'd call that tokenization.
What do you make of Premier Smith's argument? She kept coming back to the long-term consequences of starting this treatment, even the puberty blockers early, and certainly the surgeries, on your ability to, say, have children down the road, should someone change their mind or want to be in that situation, and that this really needs to be done to protect young people from making permanent, unalterable choices while they're still very young and maybe don't grasp the full implications.
There's so much to unpack here, right? And you had just mentioned that the amount of legislation attacking a very small group of people, and the amount of resources that the government has spent is unfathomable. And so, when we kind of like break down some of those pieces, there's a lot of conversation about gender affirming surgery. Gender affirming surgery for trans and gender diverse youth under the age of like 18 is virtually non-existent. And if there are cases, those are exceptional cases. We're talking like what I can count on one of my hands. So this conversation about like restricting access to surgeries, this really rings to me of dog whistle. I'm not going to lie about that. In terms of access to, puberty suppressing medications, this is absolutely heartbreaking. So much of the work that we do as an organization, so much of the counseling that the Premier had just referenced, and support that's required, is to heal the trauma that comes from going through a puberty that doesn't align with your gender identity, going through a puberty that just makes you feel like you're, an alien in your body. The whole point of puberty suppressing medications, and we've seen it in countless pieces of research, and I can tell you I've seen it anecdotally in the time that Skipping Stone has been around, in the 7 or 8 years, we've supported over 10,000 individuals across the province. Getting in early and allowing youth to thrive, as opposed to coming in later and having to work through healing trauma, those things are night and day. Let's not be reactive, let's be proactive in giving people the life that they deserve. And as far as the risks and the incidents of people changing their mind, there have been studies published in the last year that show that actually gender affirming healthcare has one of the lowest risks of all sorts of medical procedures, and lowest rates of regret. We see that rates of regret amongst sort of gender affirming care are lower than the rates of regret of appendectomies, of knee replacements, of all sorts of surgeries. So that doesn't hold any water to me either.
Well, yes, and the information that I have, I'm sure you would know that if you don't use the puberty blockers and want to have the surgery later, it's more difficult and more invasive and potentially riskier. But I want to ask, a pronoun change is not an irreversible choice. And this policy says that the parents will still be notified even if they're aware in advance that it could cause psychological harm for the student by telling them to just make guidance counselors available. Look, I love my kids. Every parent thinks they're a good parent. Not every parent who thinks they are is a good parent. What do you make of the potential risks of that, of notifying a parent even when it's known there could be psychological harm for the kid?
Look, nobody is devaluing the role of parents or families. In fact, we'll be the first ones to say it, as will so many people. The role of families in the success of allowing a trans or gender diverse youth to flourish is essential and is irreplaceable. But coming out to our families, that's big stakes. Those are the people closest to us. And so sometimes we just need to develop some confidence, some space, find some supports, get some kind of traction under our feet before we have those big conversations. There was actually a study released by MacEwan University this week that showed amongst trans and gender diverse youth in Alberta that over 90% felt safe in their schools to express their gender identity, that only 10% of them felt that there was a risk. But on the flip side, 40% of youth felt like there was a risk or had experienced some adverse relationships, some tension with their family.
Right.
And so I think what we're trying to do is create a space where, let's go for the easy wins. Let's help youth build some confidence, and then they'll be able to navigate those conversations with families, with parents, with others in a way that's going to be way more successful and allow for way more opportunity to thrive.
I went looking for this data just as a final point, and I can't find it anywhere, but these restrictions on trans women playing in sports, I mean, I've coached women's sports, I've run sports leagues, been on their executives in the past, and usually you handle it at your league level. I appreciate it's different. It's super highly competitive, things where scholarships could be on the line and different things like that. But how many trans women are there competing at a high level? I mean, when you're such a small part of the population to begin with, it has to be a low number. I can't find data on it. Do you have any on it?
I don't have data myself, but I will tell you, I was just reading an article in the Edmonton Journal right before it came on, in which the Premier of Sport or the Minister of Sport and Tourism says they don't have any data either.
Right.
But there is a report in the US that says, like, maybe all across the US, there's 100 trans athletes competing in competitive sort of levels. And so when we don't have any data in our province, and we're talking about 100 people across the country of the United States of America, why are we spending months and months of resources talking about, I don't know what the equivalent would be, and it's exactly what you said, 1, 2, 3 individuals in the province?
Yeah, you hear the stories. I don't know how real all of them are, but I have yet to see some numbers on it. Look, Amelia Newbert, we're out of time. It's Amelia Newbert, the founder of Skipping Stone. Thanks for being here, and let us know when and if you decide to file the lawsuit, and we'll follow up. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much.